Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 61, and today I'm here with Chelsea Brennan talking about allowances. Chelsea is an ex-hedge fund manager turned financial educator and the founder of Smart Money Mamas and its monthly membership community, the Motivated Mamas Society. She is dedicated to changing the way we talk about money and helping mamas create the healthy money habits that help them achieve their biggest goals. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. When I announced the launch of the Sage Money course, I knew it would stretch you outside of your comfort zone to consider it. Let's be honest, you come here for the homeschooling and parenting. But what I advocate for is a way of being and living in connection with children. And that living part is inextricably connected with money. And yet, money is this huge piece that is so often left outside the influence of our values. And that is self-limiting craziness. So I expected it to really only be the bravest of the brave mamas who showed up to do this work with me. And what has blown me away is that the whole Sage family community is the bravest of the brave. You all are transforming your lives. My why is freedom, but I get teary. It's such an honor to witness how the effects of this money work reverberate through every part of who you are and how you live. I get chills reading stories from women, mothers, who have stepped fully into their power and claimed their seat at the table. Stories of marriages transformed and huge stresses gone. Whole families free to live their values fully. I want that for all of you. Then again, maybe you shouldn't take the class because the more people who join and the more 5-star reviews that pour in, the more emotional I get, and the kayakers going past where I'm working on the end of a dock right now are starting to look concerned. So if you don't mind making me a tad emotional, head on over to sagefamily.com/sage-money and join us in the Sage Money class. I listened to Chelsea on her Smart Money Mamas podcast, and it's so refreshing to have a female and family perspective brought to the personal finance conversation. So I'm so excited that she agreed to join us today to talk about allowance, which is something I've been getting asked about a lot recently. So welcome to the show, Chelsea.
Thanks so much for having me, Rachel. I'm excited.
Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Absolutely. So I'm Chelsea Brennan. I'm the founder of Smart Money Mamas. I'm the mom to 2 little boys, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and my husband's a stay-at-home dad. A little about me, I started Smart Money Mamas almost 4 years ago now, which is kind of crazy blows my mind a bit. But before that, I actually worked on Wall Street and I was a hedge fund manager. And I decided that I wanted to do something that better aligned with my values, that allowed me to have more time with my family, and really helped more women view money as a tool and improve their money mindset so that they could build wealth in a way that let them create the lives that they wanted. And so that's where Smart Money Mamas came from.
I love it. And you have got that story down like pat. Let's start with baggage. Like on most of my episodes, we always start by kind of like unpacking our own stories. So were you given an allowance growing up?
On and off. So when I talk about some of the core rules about allowance, one of the most important ones is consistency. And we absolutely didn't have that. My dad would go through periods of time when he was like set up this whole allowance system that we'd have, and he'd tell us what to expect. And 2 weeks later, he'd kind of drop it and it wouldn't happen for months. And then he'd come up with a new system. And so there was never any sense of security and consistency that came with allowance, but we tried it a lot of times.
Lots of experimentation.
Exactly.
Lots of starts and stops. I was given an allowance by my mom, but I was on my own all the time. So that money, like it felt like it was necessary for my survival. Like I needed that
Gotcha.
money to like, if I fell down, I had to walk to the store, buy band-aids. Like I was just on my own so much that it felt necessary in a way that didn't necessarily translate to the very different lifestyle that I live with my kids. So we'll
Yeah.
get into more kind of how I started with my own kids and where we are now. But that was kind of the baggage that I brought to the table, was that I felt almost like a little bit sad that like I needed one. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah, it was less about learning money lessons for you, it sounds like, and more about, being put into some adult situations with money at an
Yeah.
early age.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's talk about age. When do you recommend starting an allowance?
I recommend starting an allowance as soon as your kid starts to show an interest in money. And I think that for a lot of people, they imagine starting allowance around 8 or 9 years old, and that's great. But for a lot of kids, they're ready sooner. And so for both of my boys, we started at age 3. And when you which I know is young, right? But when you look at the research, it shows that the average child can understand the function of money by age 3. They understand how it works, the fact that we use it to buy things, and they start to get curious. They start to get the gimmies in the store, right? Hey, I want this candy bar. Hey, I want this toy. And that's a good age to start to show them wants versus needs, to let them practice with their own money and the limitations of money, the fact that if they spend it, then it's gone and they can't spend it again. And so that's a good age to start a simple form of allowance, is anywhere between 3 and 5.
I love the like self-direction component that you bring to that answer, because one of the core values for my audience is like natural homeschooling, which is like self-directed education. And so we really do try to bring that into all the different areas of life. So looking to your kid kind of for when they start reaching for that skill and when they start wrestling, with all the issues around money. I love that component to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we did not start off on team allowance. So the way that we chose to live in connection with our children, just as gentle parents and unschoolers, when my kids were young, it just kind of felt unnecessary. And then in one of our seasonal collaboration sessions through the bucket system, which is kind of how we unschool, Bay
Mhm.
said that he wanted to practice more personal finance. And he presented a really compelling argument for having an allowance. And so now they all have one, and it's been great. So it took like one of my kids kind of sitting down, in one of these collaboration sessions to say, like, hey, I feel like I really want to work on these skills, and an allowance would really help me to do that. And so, having a collaborative style of parenting means you can never get too comfortable with any of your positions.
No.
So it's just about like being open-minded to the evolving needs of your kids. And my kids were like, no, this is definitely going to be a value add for us. And so we switched teams.
And that's fantastic. I love that they brought that to you. And I think that curiosity, it has to come from the kids, right? And so my kids, they listen to me talk about money all the time. They know what mama does for work, and they start to get curious. And so even with my oldest, so he's 5 now, his first interaction with allowance wasn't actually really allowance. We have chickens. And so he wanted to sell the eggs, like he wanted to sell our extra eggs. And so we kind of let him have his own little baby entrepreneurial thing, but we put some allowance structure into how he was allowed to use that money and give, save,
Mm.
spend jars from that. And then obviously, not obvious if you don't have chickens, they lay a lot, they lay a lot more eggs in the summer. And so by fall, winter, he didn't really have eggs to sell. And so then we wanted to add that consistency, like I said, that was important earlier.
Right.
And so then we added allowance on top of that.
That makes so much sense. I think like when my kids were young, we really, our approach to financial uh, education involved a lot of including them in the family economy. And if they
Mm.
wanted to do something, we would kind of sit down and say like, okay, you guys said you wanted to do this. You also said you wanted to do this. And so this is like how much we have available for, adventures. So like, which adventure should we do first? And how long will it take us to save for the next one? And all that kind of stuff.
Which is amazing. Like that's I actually think the easiest way for a lot of us to start, especially if you're worried about being able to have that consistency with allowance. Like
Yeah.
one of my favorite activities with our boys is letting them like pick an area of the grocery store that they get a choice in, right? So we come in and we'll say like we have $25 for fruit this week. Why don't you guys go pick what fruit we're going
Mm,
to get? And they'll notice, hey, if I get strawberries, I don't get
yeah.
that much fruit, but if I get oranges or I get apples, we get a lot more fruit. And so showing them how to make those trade-offs and the opportunity cost is an amazing lesson.
Yes, yes, I love all that. And like we are like out on adventures and traveling and that kind of stuff a lot. And so a lot of times like I would find at least once a week we were in some sort of a food court or farmers market kind of situation, and they would
Mhm.
all want to like eat different things for lunch or something like that. And I'd be like, "Okay, you can each have $10. Like go get whatever you want. Don't forget tax."
Yeah,
So like,
exactly.
they're like 4 years old looking at the menu and try, so I feel like we definitely included them in a lot of things. But then once my kids were old enough to start doing things independently, like where they were going off without us, like none of us were there, then they
Mhm.
started realizing like, hey, this would be a real value add if I had my own little personal, my own personal finance system in place that I can
Yeah.
use and play with and wrestle with and test things out on, which I think was totally fair, and it's been a really welcome change for us, and it's worked out really well.
Awesome.
Okay, do you recommend a cash allowance? So do you prefer like cash or electronic, digital money? What's your preference?
This is going to come back to your kid and their personality and their age and readiness. I recommend cash, starting with cash. I think definitely at those early ages, if you're starting in the 3 to 5 or 6 age range, really all the way up to usually depends on the kid, right? But 7, 8, they don't have as much, their mind isn't ready for digital currency, right? That idea of like, oh my gosh, sorry, Rachel.
Metaphorical money?
Metaphorical money, right? They
Yeah.
need that physical sign. They need to see it, and it actually helps them build a relationship with that money being spent and gone when they like have to hand it over. And so cash is a really good place to start. As soon as they're ready, as soon as they're asking you about your card and how you're paying, as soon as they kind of have some basic math skills, some addition,
Mhm.
subtraction, things like that that they can do mentally, I really recommend moving to some kind of digital system. And there's some really great apps out there to do that. There's FAMZoo, there's Greenlight that are affordable. But the reason for that is that the world is changing, right? We're already
Yeah.
seeing cash being used so much less frequently. And by the time our littles are adults, it's going to be even less frequent. And so having that ability to budget, to think about limitations about money without physically holding it is going to mean raising kids that don't go off into adulthood and overspend on credit cards, right? That think about money, that think about digital money as fake money. We
Mhm.
want them to have that practice. And so it really is an evolution, but I'd start with cash for most kids and then transition into digital.
I think that's great advice. Before we started doing an allowance, my kids always had cash and coins that they would acquire through things like birthday gifts. And then we had the spend and save jars for them in their rooms. And we would like roll coins, which was fun math. Like it would be
Mhm.
like a whole day, like once a month, we'd sort them all and count them all and stack them all, take them to the bank. It was a whole thing. And it really was like fun play with math, but they never used the money. Like the cash just did not teach them personal finance in the ways I would have assumed it would, because I think just because we don't use cash like ever. Like we're just not a family that uses cash. And like I didn't want them carrying around jars of coins and bills everywhere we went. So the vast majority of our shopping and purchases happen online. So everything
Mhm.
they would try to buy themselves would have to be like laundered through my bank account, which really separated them from how money actually works. Like if they go on Amazon to order a Lego set that they want, that they've been saving up for, like they can't actually give Amazon the money. So, you know what I mean? Like stuff like that, or like video game purchases, all of it was having to be funneled through me, which was really disconnecting them from everything everything. So I think you're totally right. Like in the beginning, I think it's really important for them to have that experience, just kind of playing with money and understanding that it has a value, it represents something. This is how they, like you said, like addition, subtraction, multiplying. A lot of that did happen through money. But
Yeah.
then as soon as we moved to an allowance, it had to be a debit card for us because that's just how we spend money. So that's how and since we've always included them in the family economy, like that's what they understood to be like spending and saving. Like that's kind of how it all worked. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, we ended up going with Greenlight, which I know you mentioned, and it just gives each kid a debit card and an app that functions like like a simple online banking. So like we would invite them over when we were doing stuff in our online banking, like, oh, we're opening a brokerage account, come and check it out, and let them enter the numbers and the keyboard and stuff like that. So like they were totally familiar with, again, like that whole just the whole digital world they're really fluent in that. So for them to have their own app that looks just like online banking worked really well. And then I have an app too. And then their allowance is automated, their savings is automated, and they have full control over managing their personal finances, which has been an incredibly valuable experience. So it really is like real learning that aligns with how we've always spent money, and they've always been a part of that.
And that brings up two really good points. One of the reasons the digital can be so great for families, even though some families are a little wary of it at first, giving their kids an app in their own bank account, is the consistency, right? You can set up automatic payments. You don't have to worry about whether you have cash in the house. And if you are starting with cash, if your kids are little, I recommend going to the bank and just taking out a bunch of ones, like put them in a more than you need, right? At least several weeks, so that you're going to have the cash there. Because otherwise that consistency does get hard. And then you're really screwing with their money mindset to some extent of like, money doesn't feel safe and secure. Is it going to be there? Is it not going to be there? And we don't want to build that practice.
Yes. When my kids sat me down to talk about money, I even had this moment of saying, just to be clear, are you envisioning like me going to a brick and mortar bank and withdrawing ones? And he's like, God, no, please do not give me cash. No, like, can we find like a debit card system? Like, okay, good. Just want to make sure we're on the same page. Like, we don't even have a brick and mortar bank. Like, we're with Ally, so it's just all online.
Yeah, we don't have a brick and mortar bank either. Our bank, they do have like a few branches, but they're in Boston and we don't live in Boston anymore. So it's like, it does make it really difficult. But the other point you brought up is autonomy and having oversight over some of the money. So when you start an allowance system or your kids start to have their own money, making sure you're setting things that they are responsible for buying, right? Like we will no longer buy things in checkout aisles. If you want a toy and it's not your birthday or a holiday or whatever, like you have to save for it, because otherwise they have money, but they never use it and they don't know why they have it. And you still end up with the gimmies because they want to spend your money. They don't want to spend their money. And so setting some rules around what are they responsible for and what are they not, even from a young age, can help make sure that they're actually practicing, that they're not just piling the money up, that they have to use it at some point.
Yes, that's such a great point. Like my kids, they go on a lot of like bike rides, and like they'll like hang out with friends and stuff. And so one of the things that we've collaborated on is that like I'll pay for meals. So like if you're getting together with a bunch of friends to have lunch, like I'll transfer like an extra, $10 for your lunch in there. But I'm not like, don't call me and say, can I have $5 for ice cream? Like that's allowance territory. So like I'll provide like a meal, like if you're there for like around a meal time, but any like snacks or trinkets or things like that, like that's all you. That's all you to sort out.
And I think this is so much for your audience, Rachel, with unschooling and having these open conversations with your kids. There's just the reminder that this is an evolution, right? And whatever guidelines you set up to start might not be what works for your family. And what works for one kid does not have to work for another kid. I think this is another thing that we miss a lot. There's a lot of conversation about fairness when it comes to allowance.
Fairness is not sameness in parenting in general, which is something I'm often reminding people. So I love that you're bringing up this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the lessons, my kids aren't old enough for it yet, but something that I've heard from other money influencers that I love is when a kid's reaches a certain age around 12, 13, letting them have the responsibility to buy their own clothes, right? And so you decide how much as a family is their budget for the year and you give them that money and they are responsible for buying their own clothes, right? So they budget, they can decide if they want to go get something fancy or they want to go to the thrift store and use the rest of the money for something else, right? It's up to
Yeah.
them. But when it comes to that, if you have a kid that has a job and needs, different clothes to go to work, or you have a kid that plays a sport and needs uniforms, like those budgets do not have to be the same, or even girls versus boys, right? You talk about pink
Oh,
tax and the fact that girls' clothes are more
ugh.
expensive just because, ugh.
Yeah. Just so
Those
they can
budgets.
remove some of the fabric.
Exactly. Exactly. We can set those budgets differently and we can set the rules for our kids differently as well. And so it's just an ongoing conversation and letting them know that we're learning too, that we don't have this money thing 100% figured out. Like this is a journey that we're all on.
Absolutely. Like my oldest starts college. She's 15 and she starts college in the fall and she's about to take her drive test in the state. You can actually take your driving tests while you're still 15 and then you just get your license when you're 16. So she's like trying to get all the ducks in a row so that she can drive to and from herself. And so we
Mhm.
said that we would incorporate into her allowance enough for gas money to cover the drive from our house to school and back, because I would
Yes.
be driving her, like if she didn't, if she wasn't doing that on her own. So like we would happily, budget that and factor that into her allowance, the gas money to get there and back. And so like her allowance isn't going to look the same as her younger brother's allowance who's not driving to and from school. So yeah, I love that like fairness is not sameness in terms of like affection or just generally meeting needs across the board. Everybody's needs are different and allowance can be a part of that too. So I love that. And then just one last thing I kind of want to highlight about the format, particularly about if you do digital. I love that you can incorporate the automation, because that's like
Mm.
my favorite tool of personal finance. Like that's a big part of the formula for how we are really successful with money, is that we sit down and we front load like all of our decisions based on our values and our priorities. So like save first, like right off the top, the money gets sent to all of these places that are a priority for us. And then we live on what remains. And so being able to help the kids develop that muscle, like it's not even so much that I care what they choose to save for, like they get to pick their own savings goals, but that they have kind of these automations in place, like the allowance drops on the first of the month and then 50% of it automatically goes into the save. And they have sort of these like automations that are again individualized, right, like based on things that they're trying to save for. But I love that, just that they're learning that skill.
Absolutely.
All right. What are your thoughts on the controversial earned component that some families incorporate with an allowance?
This is the great debate, right? So it's so funny in the personal finance world, it is a big debate. I am on the side of allowance as a tool to teach money and not as a tie to things that we do around the house as just a regular member of the family. It's what works for our household. But it also, there's a few parts here. First of all, from a logistical standpoint, I do not want to be having to figure out, did you clean your room well enough that I have to dock your allowance to, like, I'm just don't have the time for that.
Yeah.
Like, clean your room. Like, that's what's going to happen. But the other side of it is I'm raising two young men. And so I want them to pull their weight at home, right? And they have the benefit of being raised by a stay-at-home dad. And it's being modeled for them. But I don't want them to think that they get paid for doing things around the house. It's just not something that works for our family. Some people really like the fact that it's teaching them how work works, that you do something and you get paid for it. But even that, I don't necessarily love that lesson. I think that a lot of what we've learned about earning money is that it has to be hard. And if you're not working hard, you don't earn money, which is actually not how it works. When you talk about people who have the most amount of wealth, right? Like
Right.
you can automate, you can be an entrepreneur, you can have passive income. And so I'd
Mhm.
rather them learn creative ways to earn money and not tie it to kind of physical manual labor at home. So that's how we think about it.
Oh, I love all of those points. And that's such a good point. Like our investments, I don't have to work hard for those. Like our retirement accounts grow. And
Well, and
I'm
it's such a damaging narrative, I think, for when we tie as a society hard work to money, and it's like, okay, are janitors not working hard? Are they not working up at
Yes.
4:30 in the morning and working their butts off, but they're not getting compensated for it? And so let's break that narrative a little bit, and we can talk about other ways that we determine how much money people make.
Yes. Oh my God. I remember reading some statistic and I'm totally going to fudge it up, but it was something, it would take like a minimum wage employee like 70,000 years to earn $1 billion or something like that. And it's like, like, pull any billionaire as an example, but like Jeff Bezos is not working 70,000 times harder than the janitor. Like,
Exactly.
so that doesn't like play out. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm gonna link to episode 21 with Alfie Kohn. But if you know me at all, you know I am against paying children for chores because the research shows that rewards kill intrinsic motivation. So basically, I agree with everything Chelsea just said. Like, I'm not getting, particularly like there's like the feminist in me that's like, I don't get paid for any of this labor that I do. And then you're going to be paid. It just doesn't sit well with me on that front. And then also it results in them doing things less. Like
Yes.
in my bucket system course, we talk a lot about that, about like rewarding kids for doing work around the house, for doing chores, or for even, schoolwork and things like that, that the studies show that it actually results in less effort being put in, less motivation, less self-direction. Like if there's a piece of trash on the floor that they see as they're walking down the hall, they'll just pick it up and throw it away just because they feel a sense of personal responsibility and belonging, and like what they do for the family has value. If you reward them every time they pick up a piece of trash on the floor, they stop picking up the trash. It starts to feel more miserable to them. They start to basically, there's this force that happens where they need an increased reward in order to get the same level of dopamine in the brain.
Yep.
And dopamine is where we get motivation, and you like habituate to it. So then you need more and more and more to muster the motivation to do the thing. And then you just stop doing the thing. So
Yeah, the serotonin treadmill. Absolutely. And I think that there's also, they try to do the minimum amount of work. I said, like,
Yes.
I don't want to have to determine how clean their room has to be, but they will try to figure out, like, what's the minimum I need to clean my room that
Yep.
mom does not dock my allowance. We're not playing that game. Like, I'm just not doing it.
I agree. But we will sometimes offer our kids money for jobs that are outside the scope of what would be an expected contribution for them. So,
Yes.
like, for example, I power washed the deck to prep for repainting it, and like hundreds, if not thousands of paint chips flew all over the yard. We have like this really big deck. And I could have asked the kids to help me pick them all up, and they absolutely would have. But I really wanted to just stay focused on what I was doing up on the deck, and I wanted them picked up like quickly before it got dark. So I offered them each $10 and they were down for it.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Extra jobs are great. And even, we have chickens, they're family chickens. Like Hank's not old enough yet to really understand the cost of feed and profit. We're not there yet.
yeah.
But it does, like, yeah, he takes care of the chickens. It's part of what he does. And as that, when we have extra eggs, he can sell them. But it also comes back to, we've had days where he and the younger one want to go out and pull the eggs out of the chicken coop and break the eggs. And part of me, that breaks my brain. I'm like, this is wasteful. This is terrible. But my husband's like, you know what? It's kind of fun to break eggs. And so the conversation can be with Hank on that day. Okay, bud, like, you broke the eggs. I hope you have fun. Like, now you don't have any eggs to sell. And it completely changes his mindset. Like, we've actually had days where his little brother breaks the eggs and you hear Henry from the chicken coop go, my inventory. And it's just my favorite thing in the whole world. But yeah, I think that for extra jobs, for extra work, that's okay.
Yeah.
But for just being part of the household, not something we would do.
I agree. I think for me, like the thing that helps me decide if it's okay or not is that they are free to decline. Like if I offer them some sort of extra thing that would be helpful to do that I'm willing to pay them for, like they're free to decline it. If they're not free to decline it, then I'm not going to pay them for it.
That's a great rule of thumb. I like it.
All right, let's talk about savings. How do you recommend teaching kids the importance of saving?
Keep it age appropriate. I feel like we keep coming back to this, right? And like knowing your kid, but a lot of us learn the power of compound interest and compound growth as adults, and we just want our kids to start saving earlier and investing earlier and seeing the benefits of all that growth. And so we see sometimes parents say, okay, 50% of my kids' allowance is going towards their college fund and their retirement, right? We're putting this away. And they get super excited. It happens a lot, Rachel, because they are seeing that they're behind as an adult. And so now they're trying to catch their kids up. But that's not something our kids understand, right? Retirement is 60 years away for some of these kids, right? Like it's just not, doesn't work. And so what I think about is really staged growth. Like start with little kids of, can they set a goal that's takes them a month to save for or 2 months to save for? And once they hit that goal, can we do something a little bit bigger? And like saving, especially for kids that are spenders, a good way to reframe saving is that saving is just future spending. You are putting money aside to spend it in the future. It doesn't mean it has to stay in the bank forever. Even your retirement, you're eventually going to spend that money in retirement. And so letting them show, like some parents say, okay, well, if I let them save 2 months for a Lego, they didn't really save it. They bought a Lego. And it's like, but they had to delay gratification. Like that's how saving works. And so that's what I would do. I would stage it out. I would pay attention to your kid. If something seems like it wasn't hard for them, they were perfectly happy waiting 6 weeks, try a goal that's going to take them 8 weeks or 10 weeks and build it out. And sure, once they're 13, 14 years old, saving for a car in 2 years or saving for spending money in college, that's something they totally understand at that age, but just keep it age appropriate.
I completely agree that like the natural normal child development here, like we have to factor that in. Like just I want to emphasize that children have, just like Chelsea said, children have a very short timeline for saving, kind of like how our adult minds can't quite grasp the vastness of distances across space. Like, you know how like a scientist sometimes try and hammer that point. Maybe we just watch a lot of science documentaries, but they're like, no, you don't understand how far apart these are. Like literally the human brain cannot grasp it. And it's the same for kids. Like whether it's 6 months or 60 years, those are basically the same thing to a young child. Like literally those are the same.
And it actually, at some level, it's the same for adults. Like, and there's actually a ton of really interesting research around saving for retirement and why it's so hard for people to save for retirement. And the idea of a future you, right? Like you in 30 years is really hard for us to contemplate. Like we can get it, like when we're talking about it, but on a day-to-day basis, that is really hard. And so there's been some research suggesting that if you name that person, like give them a different name than you, imagine them, like what they do, like here's Sally, who's 65 and she travels around and she wears goofy, sundresses, like literally make it a different person and you are saving for them. And then when you're trying to make decisions about retirement, you're like imagining, okay, I'm talking to Sally. Is Sally pissed at me right now because I just pulled $2,000 out of my IRA to go on vacation? Like, or is Sally like on board? That actually helps. But this idea of like super long-term saving is not natural for us. And so it's definitely not natural for kids who, like you said, their brain just has not developed those concepts yet.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about like, okay, they've only been alive 6 years. They can't possibly grasp. And I love your point though. And like I totally have this vision and this story of like who I am in retirement. My husband and I are on kayaks and we live on this lake house and I want to be able to eat out every single night for dinner. And so if I'm, like deciding how much do I want to set to automate, going into the retirement this season, it's like, well, do I want to tell her that she can't eat out on like Mondays? She wants taco shop burritos anytime she like every day if that's what she wants. Like I want to give her that. I want to give her burritos.
And this is completely off topic, but it's actually in the Motivated Mama Society, which is our membership community. We talk about retirement planning. And one of the things that we do is have people set 3 stages of budgets for their retirement personality. So like the bare bones, things didn't go as planned, but what's enough for us to be happy? For some people, this is like, I love to read and I love to be by the water. So I want to, have an apartment walking distance to the library and walking distance to a lake or a waterfront or something. And maybe it's not ideal. I don't travel, but like, here's how much that would cost me to do that. And then the middle level is like, okay, I want to go out to eat every day. Like that's my kind of like, that's my middle one. And then we call it the high roller one of like, okay, if things were amazing, right? Like, would you buy a lake house? What would you do? Like, what's your big thing? And when you know the budgets of those 3 stages, then you can set savings goals that are specific to you, not somebody else's rule of thumb. Like you have to save 15% or you have to save 20%, and even in lean months, you can try to at least save for that bare minimum and don't feel like you're losing control, right? That you're
Yeah.
behind. You can kind of have that stage. But yeah, as clear as you can get those future pictures. And that's actually a really good point for kids too, is making it visual. And so when both of our boys are saving for something, we print a picture of it, we stick it to their jar, they see it in the morning
So
on their
smart.
on their board, because they need to have that physical reminder, that visual reminder of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and you can like scaffold up over time as they age. Like using the Lego example, like you might start with a Lego set that's like $20, but then you're like, "Oh, I just saw I know you're super into Star Wars and I just saw this $100 Star Wars Lego set. Do you want to like check it out?" You're sort of
Yes.
like inviting them into things that you know would be motivating for them to like strengthen and work on that saving muscle.
Yeah, and you can also give them some level of choice too, where you say, "Hey, you know, you have to save at least 20% of your allowance and you have to give at least 20% of your allowance." This is a little bit
Mhm.
more advanced, but whatever's left, you can either save it for your put it aside for your spending, or you can allocate it to your giving or your saving. Those are up to you,
Yeah.
because we also want to make saving not 100% just required. We want an amount that is required, but we want to give them the option to put more in there if they want to, because we want them to flex that muscle.
Yeah, so smart. Like when we sat down and had that collaboration session, we were super flexible about like how much seems like the right amount and when would you like to receive it, and okay, you want to be able to spend it on whatever you want. And the like one of the one I would say the one requirement that I brought to the table was that they automate a 50% savings rate. Like they
Mhm.
could set whatever long-term savings goals they wanted. Like my oldest is saving for a car, so she definitely saves more than 50%. She saves like 95% because we told her we would do a price match. Like, so whatever.
Ooh, that's tempting.
Yeah, right. Like, but but then the younger kids, like that's a little like that is more of a stretch for them, like to see that money sitting there and growing, and it has like parent sponsored interest too. So like
Yes.
so they can see like, oh, here's the spend and here's the save, and the save one is growing at a faster rate. Like it's actually growing, whereas the spend one isn't, because of that like interest that's attached to the savings. So like little things like that. Like that was the one requirement that I brought to the table. Like, okay, I'm down with all this, but I really want to like build in the habit of having a 50% savings rate. So
Mhm.
are you okay with that? Like, are you willing to meet me on that? Like, I'll do all these other things that you want. And in turn, you're going to be okay with the 50% savings rate, particularly knowing that you can set whatever long-term savings goal you want. It just has to be something that you work toward over time. And thankfully,
Mm.
they all thought that was reasonable and down, and they liked that idea. So it's still working really well.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. I also wanted to bring a neurodiversity piece here when we're talking about saving, just to say that certain ways of being, like the ADHD style of brain, for example, will always be challenged in areas like delayed gratification and impulse control. And it's important to not shame those challenges and instead focus on embracing and loving and honoring the way you or your child's brain might work by accommodating your needs. For example, automation, which I already said is like my favorite, is a super accommodation for that ADHD style of brain, because they don't have to just try to like remember to transfer funds on this day or resist the impulse to spend the money. No, hopefully it'll be there by the end of the month. Like, automation can help with that. But I just want to add in that neurodiversity piece, because particularly when we're talking about money and we're talking about kids, it can get very shamey around like delayed gratification and impulse control. So I just wanted to
It
kind of
can. And
bring
as an
that in.
added tip there, zero-based budgeting, which is a concept of giving every dollar a job. So instead
Yeah.
of having a bucket of big saving money, they have, $30 to spend. It's making sure that's separated out by what they need, can be really helpful for kids with ADHD, where you, especially early on, sit down with them and say like, okay, this is this month's savings money that you're set aside, or spending money that you have set aside. What do you want to be able to do this month? And actually prompt them and say like, hey, okay, I know you want to be able to, have money for ice cream, but I know that you're going away with Robbie this weekend and you're probably going to want to buy something at the comic book store. Do we want to create a category for that? And so there's tools like YNAB. If you use YNAB as a family, which just stands for You Need a Budget,
Mhm.
you can create kid accounts. Things like Greenlight and FamZoo allow the kids to create different spending buckets, and you can do that as well. But helping them kind of think through that, and so that then they can see, okay, I actually only have $10 for this other thing. I don't have 30, even though the account, if the account says 30, they will think they can spend 30.
Right.
And so
Right.
it's helping them kind of think through that early on.
Yes, such a great tip. All right, and let's talk about judgment. I don't judge their money choices. Like that's a really important thing that I want to make sure we're covering in this conversation. View the natural consequences they experience as valuable lessons. They don't need you to add an exclamation point to them, because then it becomes about their relationship with you and not about their relationship with money. Children learn through experience. We all do, actually.
Yep.
But most kids blow it with money upon launching because they have no experience at self direction on the heels of a childhood where every aspect of their lives was managed and controlled by an authority figure. They need to earn, spend, and save, regret purchases and fall short on savings goals, make mistakes and achieve successes on their own 2 feet, like true ownership of their mini fortunes while the stakes are harmlessly low. And this is the evolutionary purpose of play, right? Which is something we talk a lot
Hmm.
about on this podcast. They need freedom in order for that to happen. So, talk to us, Chelsea, about letting them make mistakes.
That autonomy, that's the biggest piece, right? We've already talked about it earlier in this episode of letting them have experiences with money. And so this is a part, I'm so glad you brought this up and that we're going to talk about this, because how do I teach my kids about money is one of the most common questions we get. And my number one answer to moms always is deal with your own money stories. And so we start in the Motivated Mama Society, we start on
Mhm.
our podcast all about figuring out your own money mindset. What are your beliefs about money? What are your hangups? Because if you haven't really gone deep on what your money fears are, what your money limiting beliefs are, you are going to push them on your kids, and you're going to push that judgment on your kids without even meaning to, because it's
Yes.
not about what they did and it actually being that big of a deal. Like, who cares if they buy a toy and it breaks and
Yeah.
they've wasted that money, right? It doesn't matter. But your brain is triggering some other thing and it's making you
Mhm.
scared. And so you're trying to protect them, and it really influences their whole ability to learn. And so, first things first, we talk about judgment and being able to have these experiences with our kids and let them make mistakes is really doing some true internal work on your own money relationship.
Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. And this is really the root of so much of the parenting topics that we talk
Mm,
about on this podcast too. Like that we need to just lean back. Just
yeah.
lean back and just be this like unconditional love safe harbor, but just lean back and give them that space to grow into their potential. And growing into your potential is going to involve making a lot of mistakes. I don't even like the word mistakes, because it's like all of these experiences are really valuable and they're going to learn things about themselves and the world through all of the decisions that they make with their money.
And you'll see too, as they make these mistakes, that we're not the only ones talking to them about money, teaching them about money, right? They're reading, they have friends, they hear friends' parents have these conversations. And so pay attention to what shame are they picking up from other places, especially when they make, like like you said, mistakes is not the best word, but when something goes not the way they want it to go, try to pay attention to what they seem to be experiencing. And sometimes you'll hear kids say something like, well, I can't believe I wasted that money, or I totally screwed it up, or I'm just bad with money. And pointing out to them, like, hey, yeah, maybe this didn't go how you wanted, but remember that we set this rule and you're already saving 50% of your money. So yeah, maybe you made a mistake with this spending money, but you're still way ahead of the game. You're still like, show them those things, and then also be willing to tell them about times that you maybe didn't get it quite right. And I
Mhm.
think that this is another thing that comes up a lot in our community, is that parents think that they have to have all the money answers before they can teach their kids. And that's not what this is about at all, right? Like, just like any area of life, which you talk about on your podcast all the time, we're all learning. And
Yeah.
this has to be something that we're working on together. And so it's really about getting comfortable with your own mistakes and then letting them know that they're fine, that they're learning, that they're figuring it out, and that this is practice. This is what this is for.
Yeah, yeah. And the bulk of what I do, like if I have to describe something I do that's active, is just to ask questions to
Mm.
challenge some of the messages that I see landing on them from out in the world. Like I was watching this video on my phone, and two of my kids are with me, and this dad said like, well, money will always be stressful, just a sort of like this throwaway
Oh,
comment. And I like paused the I like felt that, you know, and then like I
oh yeah.
paused the video, and I just kind of looked at the kids and I was like, is that true that money is always stressful? You know, and the kids like looked at each other and thought about it for a second. They were like, no. My youngest was like, money takes us to Great Wolf Lodge. It's like, that's right. Yeah. Like, yeah, that's awesome. Cool. You know, and then, okay, just carry on. But just even that process of like asking that question, like I didn't necessarily explicitly disagree with it to them. I just sort of, anytime I just can sense those messages landing on them, I try to just take, even if it's 1 minute, to just ask them. I think that gives them that pause and that awareness that, oh, this is like something just hit me. Take a second to think about how, if I agree with it, you know, if I want to keep that, if I want to set it down.
And this really funny. I love asking them questions, especially when it comes to just anything that their messages they're picking up. But my biggest reminder of that and why it's important and why we so often bring our like own adult perspective and baggage into things our kids are experiencing. This is just a funny story. I was like 10 or 11 and I was in the car with another kid I played hockey with, and his dad's driving, and we're just driving down the road, and my friend looks out the window and goes, "What do they do there?" And his dad gets really uncomfortable, like super uncomfortable, and is like, well, that's a place where women take their clothes off for money. And my buddy Brian goes, at the trolley museum? His dad, he was looking out one window, his dad was looking at the other window. And like instead of saying to his dad, like, well, what do you mean? Or where, like, he didn't clarify, he just answered what is on his mind. And like, now I always am asking my kids follow-up questions of like, well, what do you mean you want to know where? Like, because you might be having a conversation you really don't want to have.
Like, well, what do you think they do there?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's just, you know, there are times, this was actually just today. My husband brought the boys to lunch while I was recording a different podcast, and he took the boys to go to the bathroom before they went there, and they show up at the restaurant. It's like 5 minutes later, and my 3-year-old's like, I gotta go to the bathroom. And so my husband's like, fine, like whatever. He walks in, he's like, didn't you just go to the bathroom? Like, why do you always want to go to the bathroom as soon as we go to a restaurant? He looks at me, he goes, I want to know what kind of flushers they have in the bathrooms. Jeremiah's like, okay, so I can stop running to the bathroom when we walk in because you're really just curious. You don't have to go to the bathroom. But yeah, just these this is just, we've gone way off on a tangent here, but like,
I love it.
just clarifying with them and asking questions and figuring out how their brains work instead of just trying to answer a question they haven't even necessarily asked, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. I love when we get off topic. That means we're having fun.
Exactly.
I asked the Sage Family Village what questions they had about allowance, and they want to know how much is a good amount to give for an allowance. So, what advice do you have on that?
Oh man, I wish there was one easy answer for this. For this, look, I could just give you a number.
A chart.
Some people, a good place to start is $1 per year of age, especially when kids are little. That's a good starting point. What is actually the right number as your kids get older and you're using this as a learning tool is enough money to do some of the things that they want to do, but not all of the things that they want to do. Right. And so you have to make sure that they're having to make choices, that they're understanding trade-offs, that there are limitations, prioritizing, but you know, that they're not strapped if you can do that. Obviously, one thing I want to mention is there's a ton of privilege that comes into the allowance conversation, right? Not all families have extra money to do allowance with. And there are tons of ways to teach your kids about money that don't have allowance. But if you have the ability to do that, that's what I would figure out. I would talk to your kids about what they think they should be able to use their allowance for, what you expect them to use it for, and then pick a number that forces them to do some prioritizing on their own.
I think that's really great advice. And I completely agree. I think that number is going to look so different depending on like I said at the beginning of this episode, like I was on my own a lot of the time. So I needed more allowance than certainly my kids would need because we're together most of the time. So like I'm providing all their meals and paying for the experiences and things like that. So the things that they actually are responsible for buying on their own are much fewer and farther between than what I had to pay for. So definitely just looking at, I love that perspective that you brought in. Like they should have enough to where they can get some things that they're excited about getting and not be able to afford all of the things that they could ever, possibly have a split second impulse to want in that moment. And they can buy all those. Like that's probably too much.
Exactly.
Yeah. My one word answer would be collaborate. Like, let's try it, see what we learn, and then come back together and make any adjustments. Like that's basically what we talked about in that collaboration session that I mentioned when we started Allowance was like, okay, what number do we all think would be a good number to start with? Okay, like let's do that and let's try it. And then if it feels like it's not enough or it feels like it's too much, we can always come back together and make adjustments either way.
Absolutely. And if your kid's 4, that's a much harder conversation to have. I think that's when going back to like year of age, like dollar per year of age is a perfectly fine place to start. And then just let them practice little amounts. But as they get older, absolutely keep that line of communication open.
All right. The show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast61, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So what, Chelsea, are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic?
Ooh, I think the number one resource I dig into from our site is we have a free resource called the Family Money Values Template, which actually talks you through what do you want to teach, what lessons do you want to teach as a family, what matters to you, how do you want your values to be expressed with the ways you use your money. It's not specifically allowance based, but you need this group understanding to really make good choices around the language we use in front of our kids when it comes to money, what we expect them to do with their allowance. And so that's a really good place to kind of deep dive. And there's a podcast episode that goes in tandem with that. That's where I'd check out first.
Excellent. And I'm going to link to all of these along with, I actually listened to that allowance episode of your podcast. It was the first thing that I'd listened to about allowance that I actually felt like, hey, that resonates with me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
It's I think because my parenting values are definitely they're not mainstream. So it's hard to find resources. Like I can talk about money with a lot more people. I can talk about, but there's this intersection between the two is rare and far between. So I know a lot of my audience has kind of exists in that squeeze as well. So I think that for all of you guys listening, Chelsea is a really wonderful resource. I enjoy listening to her podcast, particularly that episode on allowance I know I'll link to. But just her podcast in general is something I enjoy listening to. I follow her on Instagram. So I'm a fan. And thank you so much, Chelsea, for coming here and having this chat with me.
Thanks so much for having me, Rachel. This was fantastic.